Something people always ask me about is writing original fills and beats and pretty much any pattern around the kit that is original and written creatively. I think the answer to that is as simple and as complicated as it's just a creative interpretation. But I think I've actually got a really good system that I'm going to call the beat Shizzle system for writing creative beats from scratch. It's really simple. If you follow it step by step, you'll definitely arrive at a beat or a groove that is creative and that you wrote and that sounds cool, hopefully, but it's not as creative as listening to a melodic riff and kind of writing a beat that goes along with a melodic riff or along with a song or something like that. This is like a really structured system. I think it's a very good starting point. If you just started playing drums, or if you've always struggled to write fills or beats, then I think this is a really good starting point. Like I said, very structured, step by step. If you follow all the steps from start to finish, you'll definitely arrive at a pretty legit sounding groove. Not much creativity involved, which is nice. You can get to that later on. Once you get comfortable with writing your own material, I think best case scenario, you want to arrive at a place where you can creatively write beats, listening to melody and writing a beat that fits the melody. But for now, foolproof, legit, sweet beat Shizzle system, step by step. I'm just going to start with step one, which is just to lay a bass. So just create a grid. It's really simple. You just play 8 notes on the hats. Just 8 notes. So it's the why this is step one is because in my mind I need a grid. Like I need a structure that I can be creative within. But without a structure, you're just all over the place. So just to create that structure and to create a system where I can kind of start moving creatively within, I just play 8 notes on the hats and I just loop them. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Ridiculously simple, super easy, just creating a grid. So this is what it sounds like. So 8 notes. Super simple, really easy. I kind of try to show you where the 1 was every time, but you actually don't really have to worry about that even. I really want to get away from counting now. I just want to create a grid that I can work from, which is 8 eighth notes, just being played on the hats. Consecutively, just loop the pattern. That's step one. Step two is to add 2 strokes on the snare drum at any place in these 8 notes. So you can stick to the grid. You can play it on the count if you want to, like that. You can play it like on one of those counts, or you can play it in between if you're comfortable with that. I know it took me quite a while when I started playing drumming to kind of get used to the fact that you don't always have to play on the grid. You can kind of get that independence going and separate your hands or separate your foot from your hand and kind of play in the middle of the 2 strokes. But for now, if you feel comfortable with just playing along to the grid, staying on the count, you can do that. That's really easy, that's really simple, and I think it'll help you to grasp what the flip we're trying to do. So I'm just going to play the 8 notes, and I'm going to play 2 snare shots within those 8 notes, and I'm going to loop that pattern. I'm actually just going to stick to the grid because I'm not going to make it complicated and play in the middle. I'm just going to stick to those notes and add 2 snare shots. So that's where I'm going to place those 2 snare strokes for now. That's where I'm just going to leave them there for now. I didn't think about it. I didn't think I want to create this feel. I just thought that's what I want to play. I'm just going to put them there. So that for the moment, that's where I'm going to leave them. And now the next step is to add 2 bass drum strokes, also on the grid or in between the notes if you feel comfortable with that. So we're still keeping the grid going. We're still just keeping time on the hats, kind of just keeping that grid going so that we know where we are and we kind of have a reference to where these notes are. So I'm just keeping the grid going. This is my point of reference, the hats. That's why I keep it going. The 2 snare shots, I now place them on wherever I wanted to place them, and now I'm going to use the bass drum and add 2 more notes on the bass drum, also inside this grid. wherever you feel comfortable to place them, I'm once again going to place them on the notes, just to keep it simple. So this is now keeping the grid going on the hats, 2 notes on the snare drum at random places inside this grid, and then just 2 notes on the bass drum also somewhere inside the grid. So I just added those 2 strokes on the bass drum, and I want to say that I didn't know that was going to happen. So when I played this, I actually just thought of adding the 2 strokes, like one at the very beginning of the bar and one kind of in the middle of the 2 strokes, kind of close to the second one. But I didn't realize that the bass drum stroke close to the second snare stroke is also then very close to the first bass drum stroke of the next bar. So it created kind of a, I hope I'm not losing you, but for me it kind of created a different feel than I expected. So I had to concentrate to realize where I actually put the bass drum stroke. So because this system is so random and you kind of just creating something completely from scratch, sometimes it's unpredictable. You don't exactly know what the feel is going to be like. But that's what I'm sticking to for now. 2 snare strokes on the snare drum and 2 bass drum strokes on the bass drum, randomly placed, and then you just loop the pattern. And you can immediately hear it's got a unique feel. It's not, I'm not playing a beat that I heard in a song somewhere. It's something that I created from scratch within the last 10 minutes. So that's why that has quite a unique feel. And that's exactly what we want to achieve. We want to create something from scratch. The next step then would be to play 3 strokes on the snare drum, or 3 on the bass drum, or 2 on the snare drum, 3 on the bass drum, just kind of mixing and matching, just placing them at different places inside this grid to get a different feel if you don't like the feel. So if you want to adapt it and create something new, then you can just start messing around with combinations. Like I said, I think it's a good starting point to start with. Even if you want to start with 1 stroke on the snare drum and 1 on the bass drum. Something incredibly simple, just a starting point, just to get comfortable. But if you get comfortable with that, then move on to 2, 2, or 2, 3, or 5, 3. I don't know, whatever you want to do, whatever you feel comfortable with. I think it's important to start slow, to get comfortable with the motion, get comfortable with the grid, get comfortable with being creative inside the grid, and then just start messing around with combinations and creating beats that sound good to you, beats that you like. That's the important thing. It needs to be creative and you need to like it. That's pretty friggin' important. So just start messing around with that. I think that's a good starting point. The next thing that I would do, naturally for me, would be to start messing around with dynamics. So I'm going to play the exact same beat that I played in the previous example, but instead of going like just dead 8th notes, da, 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 I'm gonna go da, 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 da. So I'm just gonna play like an accent and a note, like just kind of just vary the dynamics a little bit, just creates a little bit of a dynamic feel. And you'll see that changes the feel of the beat completely. Dynamics is incredibly important. We actually have a whole DVD dedicated to dynamics. It totally creates the feel of the beat for me. It just gives it so much more depth. So I'm going to play the exact same groove. I'm just going to vary the dynamics on the hats and check if you can spot the difference in the feel. I dig dynamics, it just completely changes the feel. It just gives it so much more depth. It doesn't sound like a drum machine anymore. It doesn't sound like somebody programmed it. So dynamics are really important to me. That's always the most important step for me. What you can do now, you can, if you've kind of got comfortable with the fact of moving around inside the grid and just adding bass drum and snare strokes wherever you want to add them, then you can start playing notes in between the 8th notes, if you know what I'm saying. So the grid is determined by 8th notes, but if you want to play in between them, so then on the 16th note accents or the 16th note values, then you can start doing that. It just gives it a totally different vibe. It's a little bit independence, especially if you're playing 8th notes on the hats, but it creates a totally different vibe. I'm going to disregard the dynamics for now because you know that concept. I'm just going to go back to a bit simpler vibe, and I'm going to try and play 2 snare strokes. One of them will be on the grid, so in other words, it'll be on one of the 8th note values, and the other one will be in the middle. I'll kind of try to place it in the middle of 2 notes, so kind of a little bit of an offbeat feel. So just the 2 snare strokes along with the hats, one on the count, one kind of not on the count. So that's what this will sound like. So one of the strokes is on the grid and one of them is kind of in the middle of 2 notes. And the way, if you haven't played that before, the way that I approached that way back when I did this for the first time 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, was to play the snare stroke not with my right hand. So in other words, not exactly on the same note that I'm playing on the hats with my right hand, but I played the note when I lifted this one up. It's hard to explain. I'm going to show you. So instead of playing like this, instead of playing that, you disconnect the 2 hands so that the left hand, the snare, is played when the right hand goes up, not down. So it sounds like this. I'm just going to play both examples, the first one first, and then you'll see what I do in the second one. So that's the concept of playing what I call it the offbeat. I don't know if it's really called an offbeat, but that's what I call it. It's just in the middle of the 2 strokes. And as you can see, that's my approach. I play it in the middle of the 2, so when the right one comes up, not when it goes down. It actually makes a lot of sense if you go into the theory, because if I'm playing 8th notes, then I'm actually playing 16th notes. I'm actually playing 32nd notes if you want to get that technical. There are just a lot of like silent notes, silent divisions in the middle, and I'm just playing the offbeat on like the silent 16th note. So that's kind of how I feel the offbeats. I play them in the middle of the 2 note values, and if you apply that same principle to our initial approach, so I still play the grid, the 8th notes on the hats, but now I disconnect the snare with my right hand, so they're not connected anymore. They don't have to play together anymore. The snare hand can play an offbeat. For the moment, I'm just going to keep the 2 bass drum strokes on the grid. So the only note that'll be off of the grid, so kind of in the middle, will be the second snare stroke. Because the first one is on the grid, the second one is off, and then I don't know where I'm going to place the 2 bass drum strokes, but they will be on the grid. So using that technique with the same example, this is what it'll sound like. It actually turned out a lot simpler than I thought it was going to be. It seems like I added the bass drum strokes on extremely even places. I actually the one that I was concentrating on the most was the second bass drum stroke that happens right after the offbeat, because I kind of wanted the offbeat to go into the bass drum, like da-doop, da-doop. I wanted to create that feel. And it just turned out that is a ridiculously simple pattern now, but maybe that's good, maybe that's really good. So I'm sticking to that for now. Now I'll do the same that I did with the first example and introduce some dynamics to the groove. I think I'll do the same thing with the hats, kind of just get that kind of vibe going again on the hats, the loud, soft vibe, and then I'll play the first snare stroke nice and loud with a rim shot, and I'll kind of ghost the second one. So it'll be like a nice loud drum shot and then a much softer one right before the bass drum. I'm going to start with the groove like I played it with no dynamics. So I'll try to take out as much dynamics as I can, and then I'll introduce the dynamics, and hopefully you can see the contrast between the two. It gives it so much more depth. I know I keep saying that, but I just love the effect of dynamics. It really makes the groove pop. I think I'll just give you guys more examples. Yeah, I think I just want to illustrate how sweet the system is. Beat Shizzle system with the flip. So in the next example, I will play 2 snare strokes again and 2 bass drum strokes again, but this time both snare strokes will be off of the grid, so in the middle of the clicks, and just one of the 2 bass drum strokes will be off. I think this is going to sound a little funky, a little weird, but let's see what happens. That's the cool thing about the system. You can kind of decide what you're going to play beforehand, and you don't really know what it's going to sound like. But I dig that. I dig that. There's a lot of space for creativity in that approach. So 2 strokes on the snare, 2 on the bass. Both on the snare will be off, and one of the 2 on the bass will be off. Obviously, still keeping the grid going on the right hand. Let's see what it sounds like. I kind of took the easy approach with just getting rid of, well, not getting rid, but just playing the down stroke, like the one that's on the grid on the bass drum, just getting that over and done with. So I play that on the 1, and then I keep the 3 funky little offbeat notes, and I group them all together into the end. That's just the easy approach, because I didn't know what the flipper was going to sound like. But that does actually sound pretty cool. I dig the vibe of that. I'm just going to introduce some dynamics into that. I don't know exactly what I'll do, but I'm just going to try and get some dynamics going between the 2 strokes on the snare drum, and definitely on the hats as well. So let's see what it sounds like with some dynamics added into the mix. You'll hear I also got more comfortable with the groove the longer that I played it, and that's the cool thing about this. You don't know exactly what you're going to play when you're playing it, because you're kind of deciding beforehand. You're kind of just placing things on random places, but the cool thing is you create something new, so it's something that you're kind of playing for the first time, and the more that you play it, the more comfortable you get with it, especially with the dynamics. I dig the dynamics. I'm hammering on that. I love the way that the dynamics just completely change the groove. Now I'll just play one more example, and I will play 2 snare strokes again, 2 bass drum strokes again, but the 2 snare strokes will both be on the downbeat, so they will both be on the grid. They won't be in between, they will be on the click, and the 2 bass drum strokes, both of them will be kind of on the upbeat, so in between. So let's see what that sounds like. So I grouped the 2 bass drum strokes close to the snare strokes again, just to kind of make life simpler for myself, because I didn't know what I was going to play. So they are both either really closely before the snare stroke, so in the gap before the snare stroke, or in the gap right after the snare stroke. I'm going to play that same groove now again with no dynamics, or with as little dynamics as possible, and then I'll introduce dynamics into the mix and see how it changes it. Just kind of move the dynamics around a little bit again. I just tried to see if if I kind of mess with the dynamics a little bit towards the second part of the dynamic bit, if it sounded a little bit different, and it did. I think that's really healthy, just to take the groove and kind of see how you can change it dynamically. Once again, a big fan of dynamics. I can play the same groove for a very long time, just playing with the dynamics and kind of seeing how it changes it. Then the next step in the system would be to move the right hand. So you get a groove or a pattern that you created and that you feel comfortable with, and then you just move the right hand to a different voice on the kit. So either moving from, doing like a really simple thing, moving from the hats to the ride, just to see how that changes it. I'm just going to do that. I'll just do that so you can see the difference that it creates in the beat. So I'll create a really simple beat between 2 snare strokes and 2 bass drum strokes, both on the grid, and I'll just play it on the hats and the snare at first, and then I'll just move the right hand from the hats to the ride, and then you can see what happens to the groove. So it's a completely different groove. It's got a totally different vibe. The one is a really nice verse groove. The one is a really nice chorus groove. So it's incredible how just changing one of the voices, so just changing your right hand, keeping the bass drum on the same place, on the same intensity, snare drum, same place, same intensity, just moving the right hand, totally changes the feel. Something else that you can do is to change the right hand periodically. So every second stroke is played on a different thing. I know that sounds complicated, but maybe going like hat, ride, whatever, just switching it up like that. I think a really good example of that would be to play a normal stroke on the ride and then one on the bell. So I'm going to play the same groove. I'm going to start on the ride, and then for the second part I will just kind of interpolate between the ride and the bell. So just to give it a totally different vibe. Check what this sounds like. It's got a totally different dynamic feel, and if you start splitting it up between things that sound radically different, because I know the ride sounds a lot like the bell of the ride, it's not a really big tonal difference. There's a big dynamic difference, but not really a tonal difference. So if you start splitting it up between things that sound radically different, like the hat and the floor tom, it'll sound totally different. It'll give it a much different vibe. Let me just play that so you can hear the difference in moving from 2 sounds on the ride that sound pretty much the same to 2 sounds that are radically different. In this case, the hats and the floor tom. It sounds like an extremely complicated and totally different beat. It sounds like something that Travis Barker would write. It's not that complicated at all. You just switch up the hands on the hats between the hats and the floor tom. That's the cool thing about this technique and about this system. It's small changes. If you just apply small changes to the groove, it totally changes the feel, and it's got that surprise factor. Like you'll play something and you'll go, what the flip, that sounds friggin' cool. I don't know where that came from. And that's what I like about this. It stimulates the creative part of you, because new things are created even if you don't realize they're being created. So changing the voices is the next step for me. Like I said, start experimenting with things, splitting up between two things that sound radically different or two things that sound pretty much exactly the same, just maybe with dynamic differences, like staying on the ride but going between the bell and the ride itself, going between two splashes, maybe going in between the ride and the hats, because they do sound a little different, but they're still kind of used for the same thing. Just experiment with that. If you get really comfortable with this and you can nail the pattern between the feet or the right foot in this case and the left hand, so between the bass drum and the snare, if you can get that pattern so ingrained in your head that you don't even have to think about it anymore, you can start messing around with complicated stuff like changing the voices in pairs of 3, not just 2, like kind of going for the polyrhythm vibe. That's really advanced though, so if you just started playing, don't break your head about that. That's quite advanced. You can totally take it slow, but later on, if you get comfortable with this, something really cool is to start changing the voices in different pairs, or maybe still like in pairs of 2, but just kind of breaking it up, or switching the up and the down beat. That's actually very cool as well. So there are so many options within this system of creating new beats that you can do, especially with regard to changing the voices. Next up, I'm just going to start with a really simple beat between the bass drum and the snare, still keeping the hat the same, but I'll be taking away, I think, 2 strokes, 2 eighth notes on the hat. I'll just be taking them away at like a random spot. The reason why I want to do this is just to introduce kind of that broken hi-hat feel into the system. So when you take it from the first step, up until this step, if you've taken a groove and you've kind of followed the whole system through, then when you reach this spot of the system, you can start introducing that kind of broken Carter Beauford hi-hat technique vibe that I love using. So I'll just be taking away 2 eighth notes on the hats, but I'll be keeping it really, really simple on the bass drum and on the snare drum. The reason for this is I don't want to think about the bass drum and the snare drum. I can play something more complicated because I've been playing drums for a while, but the reason why I want to demonstrate this with a really simple groove is just to introduce the idea of kind of forgetting about this. Not thinking about the bass drum, not thinking about the snare drum, just thinking about the hats. It's a little bit independence, but it's not difficult because this has to come so naturally. That's why I'm choosing a really, really simple pattern that you don't have to think about this at all. Your concentration needs to be on the hats. Usually, while you're playing that 8 notes on the hats, that's the grid. That's what you don't think about. Usually, you think about the bass drum and the snare drum because you kind of, this is your grid. This is your point of reference. This glues everything together. But with a broken hi-hat feel, you can't concentrate on 2 things at once. That is impossible. Nobody can do that. So you need to forget about one of these 2 things. And in my experience, it's best to kind of just practice this hard enough so that you can forget about it. I'm talking about the pattern between the bass drum and the snare drum. So I'm going to play something really simple. Then I'll be taking away 2 eighth notes on the hats. You'll see the way that I kind of introduced this technique is to still play the 2 strokes, just kind of move your hand off of the hats. That's the way that I taught myself this technique way back when I stumbled upon the sickness that is Carter Beauford's hi-hat technique. So you still play the 2 strokes or how many ever strokes you want to take out, but you just physically move your hand off of the hi-hat. That's just how my head works. Later on, you'll get used to the sound, to the feel of the groove, that broken hi-hat kind of vibe, taking away a few strokes, and you won't have to look like you're missing things that aren't there anymore. You'll be able to play it just by taking away the notes. Now I'm going to play another example, but this one has a slightly more complicated pattern between the bass drum and the snare drum. It still has that broken hi-hat feel. It's not, I don't think it's as complicated on the hats. It's just like a 3 notes, or it's 4 notes. The fourth one is just not played, so it's 3 notes and then like a little gap, and then 3 notes and a little gap. But the main thing is that the pattern between the bass drum and the snare drum is a little bit more complicated. I'm still not thinking about this. The only thing that I'm thinking about is the hats. So you take the pattern between the kick and the snare, which in essence is like the pocket of the groove, and you practice that hard enough so that you don't have to think about it anymore, so that it comes totally naturally, so that you can only concentrate on the hats. Because this is like the root of the groove for me, and you kind of color in the groove, kind of give it a nice little nuance with the hats. So I'm not concentrating on the bass drum and the snare, I'm just thinking about the hats. But this is a slightly more complicated groove. I just started messing around a little bit with the gaps with regards to the hi-hat towards the end. I really like experimenting with different broken hi-hat patterns while keeping the kick and the snare the same. It just gives it a totally different vibe. There are no rules. Like I said, you can play whatever feels and whatever sounds good. It's really nice if you're able to split. It's not really nice, it's really comfortable if you can split the bass drum and the snare drum from the hat. So if you don't have to think about this anymore, you can kind of start messing around with some broken hi-hat patterns, and it'll sound really good. So the next step then would be to add notes. In the previous section we took away notes to get that kind of broken hi-hat feel, but what I also love doing is just to keep it simple on the bass drum and on the snare drum at first, and then just to add notes. So don't worry too much about specific note values. Don't worry about, am I adding 16th or 32nd notes? Don't think about that too much. Just add what you feel comfortable adding. What I'll do now is I'll just play a really simple pattern between the bass drum and the kick drum. What I'll do now is I'll just play a really basic pattern between the bass drum and the snare drum, and I'll be adding notes. I'll be adding 16th notes, but don't worry about it, but I'll be adding 16th notes with my left hand. So my right hand won't be doing anything extra, nothing extra. It'll be doing exactly the same thing. 8 notes, 8 eighth notes on the hats, and then simple kick pattern, simple snare pattern, just adding a few extra notes with my left hand. So I'll be moving from the snare with my left hand to the hats every now and then, just kind of adding a few extra notes. Don't worry about the configuration and the note values and all that kind of complicated stuff. Just listen to the feel, and I'm sure that if you listen to it, you'll be able to replicate it just by using your ear, because it's a really simple pattern. This is what it sounds like. So it's just adding a few extra notes with the left hand. It comes extremely naturally. It's not something that you really need to think hard about, because you're just moving the left hand from the snare to the hats, adding 1 or 2 extra notes. Those were 16th notes that I added, and I played the pattern with 2 hands. But if you can get your right hand or your leading hand fast enough, you can play that with 1 hand. That's actually a lot more comfortable. So that's what this will sound like. The next thing you can do is to double the speed of those notes. So don't even worry about the note values, just listen to the sound. I'll be playing this with a double stroke on the left hand, because I don't want to look all spastic playing it really fast. I'm just going to go from the really simple pattern, and I'll just be adding 2 30-second notes But don't even worry about the notes. Why am I saying 30-second notes? Just listen to the feel, just listen to the sound. I'll play the simple pattern, adding 2 really fast notes with my left hand. Same motion, this time just using a double stroke. You can play that with single strokes if you want to. They do get a bit faster, so you might have to kind of practice that speed with your hands, but it always sounds cool in the hats, regardless of playing double strokes or single strokes. Now I'll show you a slightly more complicated groove, just hopefully to inspire you to kind of really start messing around with adding notes and taking away notes on the hats specifically. I'll still be keeping the pattern on the kick and on the snare the same. I don't want to deviate too much from that really simple pattern, because I really want to instill the idea of committing to like the roots of the groove, which is for me between the bass drum and the snare drum, and forgetting about that, and then just concentrating on the hats. So I'll still keep it really simple, but I'll just do some funky shizzle on the hats with adding and taking away notes, and see if I can't create something cool. So that's what this will sound like. So that's just messing with the principle of adding and taking away stuff, using double strokes, using single strokes. The possibilities are endless. I really hope you start messing around and stuff like that and kind of color in the grooves, because it just creates a totally different vibe. Especially also hope you notice the dynamics, like two soft little notes followed by 2 loud ones. You can start messing around with the ghost notes on the snare, kind of make the pattern between the bass drum and the snare a bit more complicated if you want to. But in essence, the thing that I love the most is kind of coloring in a groove just with a slightly complicated or interesting pattern on the hats. You can even keep these 2 really simple. This really changes the groove for me so much, and I love using kind of that kind of stuff on the hats. So that's basically the beat shizzle system for you. From beginning to end, I think if you follow it step by step, you'll really be able to create some cool grooves. The cool thing about this is it has no specific rules about placing the kick and the snare. You have total freedom. You can place it wherever it feels comfortable. You can start really slow and really simple, kind of spice it up all the way through if you want to. It just adapts to your style and to your skill level. So this is just the system that I use to create beats in the beginning, and I hope you guys can use it in your drumming.